Uh, we decided this panel was necessary so that we can address some of the issues we have with the current justice system at the level of sentencing and due process. It fits in good with our discussion of our theme of the end of mass incarceration. I first called this panel Alternatives to Sentencing and Parole, but we'll talk about that. First, we'll connect the past to the present. How did we get here? We'll see how things from a prosecutor's perspective, and we'll talk about plea bargains, enhancements, uh, enhancements in the sentencing, collateral consequences, and finally we'll look at some solutions to the problem moving forward. So let me introduce everybody. First, I have Andrew Diltz. Andrew Diltz is a political theorist who works in traditions of critical theory and the history of political thought, focusing primarily on the relationships between race, sexuality, political membership, sovereignty, and the punishment in the United States. Diltz is the author of Punishment and Inclusion, Race, Membership, and the Limits of American Liberalism, which gives a theoretical and historical account of felon criminal disenfranchisement as it has been practiced in the United States, drawing widely on early modern political theory, post-structuralist French thought, queer theory, disability theory, and critical race theory. Diltz is also co-editor with Perry Zern of Hampshire College of Active Intolerance, Foucault, the Prison's Information Group, and The Future of Abolition. Diltz is also a founding member of Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics, and the Prison and Theory Working Group. We also have Dr. Luis Garcia. Dr. Luis Garcia has worked as a program analyst. He has worked in administrative positions with HIV reentry populations, transitional housing for mentally ill reentry populations, and mental health direct service with the state parolees residing in an in-custody community-based setting. Dr. Garcia is committed to service to others, has participated as an expert panelist for convening to develop a correctional education reentry model for the U.S. Department of Education. He was a guest speaker at the first jail inmate education graduation in 2013, as well as inspiring Los Angeles County Sheriff Department volunteers as guest speakers at their annual volunteer recognition ceremony. He also participated in a professional capacity as a member of Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health Cultural Competency Committee, where he was co-chair of the Data and Forensics Division work group. Prior to his career in public service, Dr. Garcia experienced jail and state prison incarceration firsthand and earned his high school diploma in Los Angeles County systems. He earned his bachelor's degree from Loyola Marymount University, his master's in social work from the University of Southern California, and a doctorate in educational leadership for social justice from Loyola Marymount University. Dr. Garcia is a board member of the Straight Talk program and is member of the Anti-Recidivist Coalition. Hillary Blau, right here to my left. Hillary spent 6 years as a prosecutor for the San Francisco District Attorney's Office and worked with both Senator Kamala Harris when Senator Harris was served as San Francisco District Attorney, and District Attorney George Gascon. Ms. Blau is a talented and highly regarded lawyer who prosecuted a wide array of cases, led trainings for law enforcement partners, and also served as neighborhood assistant district attorney. She is a fierce advocate for victims of crime and spent many years focusing on crimes against women and children, as well as securing enhanced and stable resources for victims of crime. Most recently, Ms. Blau spent 3 years leading criminal justice reform efforts in California on behalf of Californians for Safety and Justice, where she ran the statewide implementation of Proposition 47. Her work helped promote second chances for thousands of individuals previously convicted of lower-level felonies, while also resulting in dramatic reduction in prison and jail populations, and the transfer of monies from prison spending to prevention and treatment programs. Ms. Blau has authored criminal justice reform laws for California, worked on a variety of criminal justice initiatives, including collateral consequences of criminal convictions, immigration reform, and strategies for reducing recidivism, and facilitates trainings for law enforcement attorneys, judges, elected officials, and community groups. Also at the end over here is Martina Carmen. Martina is a Soros Justice Fellow at the Public Defender Association. Martina partners with community leaders in Seattle, King County, and the UW Center for Human Rights to support community-based responses to interpersonal and state violence. Her work focuses on moving away from police and prisons as a frontline approach to addressing violence, and instead building responses to harm that uphold the needs, humanity, and dignity of all impacted people. Last but not least, Rudy Reyes. Rudy is a returning citizen that was recently released from prison. At 24, he was sentenced to 21 years of burglary with a firearm. He served 20 years, of which 15 were in solitary confinement. During his incarceration, Rudy taught himself law and worked on appealing many unjust plea bargains for others. He even revived cases that were closed for 15 years. Rudy is now a member of ARC and advocates in Sacramento for changes in criminal justice policy. He has begun a successful career in the entertainment industry and is a mentor for returning citizens seeking a similar career path through Manifest Works, a workforce development program. Currently, Rudy is working on writing and the production of his own original material. So, to begin, I would like to ask Andrew Diltz. So, the current, how did our justice system become so punitive? How do we come to be to the place that we are?
Okay, thanks. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Omar, for organizing this panel and for coming and having this conversation. I do most of my work Can folks hear me all right? Am I in the, okay. More? Or that's a thumbs up. Okay, cool. I do most of my work as a professor studying the history and theory around punitive sanction in the United States, but I also do work as a prison abolitionist and police abolitionist on the side. But I'm going to kind of wear my professor hat here for a few minutes because I'm talking with Omar about how we want to get this conversation started. I think this is actually a really great question to ask of how did we get here and what exactly do we mean by here in the first place. And some of this I'm sure will be familiar to many people in here, but so I'm going to try and make, I think, a very brief point about how we ought to think about the relationship of the history of incarceration and the history of punitive sanction in the US in relation to the current moment that we're at, where conversations around prison abolition, conversations around radical forms of reform are on the table in a way that they haven't been in recent history. And there's a really sort of dangerous line and also a very powerful moment that exists on that line about how we think about that in relation to the past, right? And so nothing I actually say here is going to be, I think, an original thought of mine, and I draw heavily on the work of black and brown and indigenous theorists and historians and philosophers, tons of whom teach here at UCLA, right? Cheryl Harris and Kimberly Crenshaw and Robin Kelly and Sarah Haley and Kelly Hernandez, who was just speaking previously here at the 2 o'clock session. And I want to acknowledge my own position, talking about this stuff as myself a colonizer and myself as a white person who benefits from the racial contract, from the sexual contract, from the settler contract. But that said, from that point of view, as somebody who's then studied some of these histories, I think really we have to answer Omar's question in at least sort of 2 senses. There's a narrow version of this answer of how we got here, and there's sort of a broader answer. And I think the narrow answer is something which a great amount of scholarship and activism has sort of coalesced around in the last 10 to 15 years, right? And this is a narrow story about how over the last 50 or so years, since the late 1960s, a series of very identifiable, very specific, and markable policies, not remarkable, but markable policies we can point to, coalesced and came together at the federal, the state, and the local level to produce the moment that we're in which the US is now widely regarded as the most punitive nation on earth. And it's often referred to as sort of, this is an exception or break with the United States' past, that we've arrived at a more punitive period than we've had historically in the United States. And there's some problems, I think, with that answer. And there's this broader sense, though, which is one that tells a story of how that narrow history is really a playing out of this country's deep attachments to racism and sexism as part and parcel with punitiveness. And that there is, in fact, I think, nothing at all exceptional about the current moment we're in if what we mean by punitiveness is the state's use of violence against its own citizens. This is a story that says what we need to talk about is this is a nation state that is a settler colony, an openly white supremacist state, a patriarchal society, and what has changed, in fact, is the form in which the violence takes place. So in a sense, these 2 stories, the narrow sense and the narrow story and the broad story, work together insofar as the narrow story tells us the how this transformation occurred in the last 50 years, and not that a transformation has occurred. So, I mean, the where we are sort of at the moment, maybe this is some of the stuff hopefully is familiar to people now. of what it means to be in a heavily punitive society, right? This is that we live in a country and a society where we have a criminal justice system that maybe more properly should be referred to as a criminal punishment system. This means that criminal convictions in the United States lead typically to severe and harsh sentences, specifically of confinement. That we have a historically unprecedented percentage of the US population subjected to such confinement, more than 1% of the population. But also that prisons is actually the tip of the iceberg, that roughly 6 to 7% of the US population at a given time is under some form of direct or indirect criminal supervision by the state, right? That at its high end, at least 8 to 9% of Americans in the United States carry felony convictions with them at any given time. And that insofar as that's the case, we're at the place now where you can start talking about a country not simply of mass imprisonment or mass incarceration, but a country of mass probation, a country of mass state surveillance, right? The here that we're talking about in the here and now is also Los Angeles, which has what is largely thought to be the largest jail in the world, if you include the entire jail complex, right? And this means, of course, and we'll touch, I think, on this more, we're a country where the collateral consequences of incarceration fall disproportionately on people of color, on women, and folks who are marginal to the system, right? So we're talking about a country where more than 2% of the voting age population can't cast a vote, and that's a margin wider than several presidential elections, multiple senatorial races, right? So insofar as this is clearly a political project, it's a project that's focused on the marginalization and exclusion of folks through a criminal punishment system. The narrow story, I think, is one that also we're becoming increasingly familiar with. It's a story that says there was a deeply punitive side to Johnson's Great Society, right? That when we coupled when welfare programs were rolled out in the 1950s and 60s, there was always the strong arm of the state behind it. This is a story that we know now about the expansion of the war on drugs under Nixon, the federalization of that war, and then its rearticulation at local and state levels. This is a story around the emergence of mandatory minimum sentencing, in which many cases were proposed from the liberal left in the United States. This is a story about the increased autonomy of low-level prosecutors and the expansion of plea bargaining as the primary way in which criminal sentencing has been practiced. This is the 98% of all criminal convictions happen through plea bargains, not through jury trials. This is the story of three strikes in California, its federalization under Bill Clinton during the 1990s. This is a story of the massive expansion of life without parole sentencing across the country, sometimes as an alternative for executions, but often even alongside executions. This is a story of the so-called expansion of so-called quality of life policing, of broken windows policing. This is the expansion of asset forfeiture as a primary way of funding local police departments, right? This is the story that tells you how Ferguson became the way that police department functions. This is, of course, an overall economic geographic story about prison construction itself, whether in forms described by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, discussing California in particular, of how California was able to grow its own prison population by more than 500% in just the last 2 decades of the 20th century, or also a story about rural prison construction following the work by John Eason, who showed that prison expansion has been presented as a jobs program and as a mode of economic redevelopment. It's a story about the systematic defunding of public education at every single level and across every single jurisdiction in the country. It's a story about the systematic defunding of public housing across the country and its increased vilification and its management by police instead of local communities. It's a story of the rise of finance capital and the rule of finance capital has over local municipalities' funding sources, especially in terms of local bond issues. And this is a list I think goes on and on. We're starting to really learn what this last 50-year story looks like, a mass convergence of a series of interconnected and interwoven political projects happening at all levels to coalesce around a couple of outcomes which are then now known and identifiable. And there is also now, importantly, a massive academic industry to discuss what exactly the root causes of these are, and the pages of everything from Jacobin to the New York Times to the Washington Post will then plays out with these fights, trying to figure out, no, this exactly, here's the one, the single thing that did everything, and then that we just fixed, and then everything, it'll be great.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, why the broader story is really, 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 really important. Because the broader story is that the place that we are in the here and the now is at the outcome of a long tradition of the political organization of society on the terms of racial marginalization, of sexual marginalization, and of ableism, right? That is to say, the broader answer is one that doesn't dismiss these narrow causes or pathways, but sees them as part of a larger project. So where is here exactly? Here is the United States as a settler colonial nation state, founded through the dispossession of land and sovereign power from indigenous people, and continually refounded and enforced through genocidal practices that were first and foremost legal practices. Here is the nation state that was founded expressly as a slave society and which justified the forced subjugation and domination of people through the terms of the Enlightenment. And as W.E.B. Du Bois has taught us, and Angela Davis reminds us, it's a nation state that actually abolished slavery, but only in a negative sense. And it did not build the positive institutions and practices of freedom necessary to abolish slavery in the positive sense. And as has been remarked upon already this weekend, and is now the topic of films, for instance, right? We wrote this into the law. We wrote this through the 13th and 14th Amendments with explicit exceptions that we could now engage in forms of slavery, forms of political exclusion, but under the language of criminality. So out of slavery, we get convict leasing. We get Jim and Jane Crow. We get prison labor, both inside the prison, but also way more prison labor outside the prison supporting the prison. We get the grounds upon which a slave society was, in fact, successfully transformed into a prison society. And this is to say, in keeping more closely with the theme of Beyond the Bars LA, here is a prison nation. And this is the language I'd borrow from the sociologist Beth Ritchie, who notes that this means we live in a political and social community that is structured by and through the use of incarceration and carceral thinking. So that's to say, if we want to talk about how we became so punitive, I think it's worth asking why we think we should even be, what we're doing should even be considered punishment, and not just the new normal operation of white supremacy, patriarchy, and settler colonialism, to name just three of the important pillars of domination. Or this broader history, or on this broader history, then the exceptionality of the punitiveness of the United States can be seen as being part and parcel with its history as a violent nation state towards its own citizens. And the form we see today, the particular punitiveness that we have at the moment, stems from this deep history that this country has as a white supremacist, settler colonial, and heteropatriarchal political project. So I want to stop there. I think these two stories have to be told in tandem, and the one should not be thought to eclipse the other. We have to talk about the last 50 years and the very specific concrete material policies that can, in fact, be undone. Right? We also have to talk about the ways in which those policies were always already manifestations of a broader history of the United States, that if it is not confronted, if we don't abolish white supremacy, if we don't abolish settler colonialism, if we don't take decolonization as merely a metaphor, but as an actual practice, we'll find ourselves re-articulating and repeating the same narrow histories again and again. Right. And this would be a part about recognizing that when we say incarceration, if what we mean is punishment, then we have to think about how those two things became linked together for us so deeply. And that is a recent phenomenon. That is not a world historic reality. There's nothing natural or determinative about that path that we're on. That this was a long-standing series of political projects, and therefore there are also political projects that can be used to work against them.
Thank you, Andrew. So I want to touch on a couple of things that you mentioned, the story of plea bargains, as you said. That given that we have mostly 95% or more of the sentencing happens through plea bargains and hardly anything goes to trial. I'd like to ask you, Hillary, if how often do you see cases go to trial, and does it always go worse for defendant's sentence if they lose in trial? And I also on sticking on the topic of being punitive, does professional reputation factor in a prosecutor for prosecutors when they present their plea bargains that they want to win the case? Is that a big factor for how punitive a plea bargain can be? Just pretty much that about plea bargains and trials.
So, can you guys hear me without this? I don't think I need it. So, I think maybe a good way to sort of encapsulate all of that is, I wanted to just start before getting to the plea bargain piece and just sort of share just quickly about sort of how I got to the DA's office to begin with. I mean, I had set out sort of to be a public defender. That was my mission. I was very focused on being able to deal with what I had seen in my own community and the people that I had seen sent to prison and people I had been visiting in prison. So that was what I was destined to do in my mind, right? That was what I wanted to do. But I had this really, what I thought was a genius idea, which was I would do an internship so I could learn more about the way that the DA's office worked, so I could infiltrate and figure things out and then use it to my advantage later when I would go to become a public defender. But what happened was I went there and I met this woman named Kamala Harris, and she was like, oh, so why do you want to be a DA? And I said, I'm not going to be a DA. You don't want me to be a DA because I'm sitting here second chairing a murder trial, and I feel bad for the defendant. I feel bad for the victim, but I feel terrible for the defendant, right? Because everybody's life is ruined now. Everybody's life is ruined. The dad's crying, everybody's crying, everybody's miserable. I'm not like happy about, oh, I want to send this guy away forever, which is what he's looking at, right? And she said to me, well, here's the thing. This is exactly what I'm looking for. And I said, well, and there's no black people that work here. Like, this is, this isn't for me. And we had this discussion about the things that she wanted to see change in the criminal justice system, and thinking that San Francisco just might be the place to do it because San Francisco is kind of just doing their own thing, right? So I took a chance and spent some time at the DA's office, and it was easy for me to do the work around protecting women and children, right? I'm a survivor of multiple things, so I was like, I can get with this, I can get behind this, I can help women find housing and protect children and do all of that work. But the problem within the DA's office is that it is designed, right, in a way, which I'll get to the plea bargain piece, that, defendants aren't actually viewed as innocent until proven guilty, right? That's just the truth. That's the dirty little secret about the DA's office that a lot of DAs are not talking about. When I left the DA's office and I started to work on this thing called Prop 47, all I was going to do then was talk to other law enforcement officials about, this is going to be something that's going to benefit all of us, law enforcement, because we don't want to spend time prosecuting low-level drug offenses, right? We don't want to do it. It's a waste of our time. It's not a good use of our time. We want to be able to work with our victims in the more serious cases, right? So that's how it started. I also went into this work thinking I was some evolved prosecutor, right? Like, I'm from the hood, I've seen this, I've seen that, I'm so evolved, and I work in San Francisco where it's, progressive, and we've got this concept of smart on crime, and we have a million different alternatives to incarceration. So I definitely felt like, oh, I've got it all figured out. So, of course, as you can imagine, I quickly learned I didn't have it all figured out. And I realized from the time that I worked with the community that even with what I thought I was bringing to that office, with my background, with my experiences, and with my perspective, that even I, in that space, was making choices because I was just somehow part of this system that was unrelenting and basically a little bit brainwashing, right, as you are working within the system. So I'm glad to say that I was able to step out and be able to look back, and I think that there have been a lot of changes from that point, where there's this attention finally. You guys have probably all seen that there's this attention on prosecutors and prosecutor reform and getting to know your DA and holding them accountable and so forth. But it was a very lonely road, 10 years ago, and even lonely just as recent as a year ago, right? And I don't think that there's enough DAs that are still talking about this and saying and admitting that the volume was such that they were just pushing through cases and looking at cases and saying, okay, what am I going to use here to find this person guilty? As opposed to, do I have enough evidence here to convict, right? Not even do I have enough evidence here to prove him guilty, he or she guilty, do I have enough evidence here to convict, right? And so as it relates to the plea bargain piece, I get asked this question a lot. And the people that have studied this and know this, I mean, it's the dirty little secret about the system. The way that it works is basically if they call it an early admission of guilt. There's a benefit for an early admission of guilt. And I remember the first time I heard that when I was working, and I was like, well, I don't understand what that means. And they said, well, if you give somebody if they tell you now that they did it, then you can give them a better deal. And it's like, well, no one's even investigated the case yet, right? We're still, information's coming in, like we don't even know if the person is guilty, right? We don't even know if we have enough to hold them accountable at trial. But the way that it works is, because the system is so jammed up, and no wonder why, right? You just heard about the history and this wide net that's been cast to entangle people in our system. The system is so overloaded, right, that we, the DA's office, we have to figure out a way to lessen the burden, to release the pressure of all the cases that are coming in and heading to trial. Because if everybody exercises their right for a trial, then the system's going to collapse. And so, in that moment, you would think that myself and other DAs would let that resonate and say, well, that does, what? But when you're working 80 hours a week, and this is no excuse, but I'm just saying, just keeping it real, this is what happens. When you're working 80 and 60 hours a week, you're just sort of moving on to the next. Okay, well, that's what my supervisor said, and I'm pushing through, and I'm pushing through, and I'm pushing through. So, to answer the question, I mean, that is how things get resolved in the DA's offices. That is why you see so many cases that are resolving in this way. There are instances, so I can understand the sort of maybe the genesis of it a little bit, that if somebody feels like they just want to get the case over because they know it's something caught on tape, and they don't want to argue, they don't want to debate, they don't want to go to trial, they want it to be over, then there is some incentive that can encourage that, to move that case along. But you can see, obviously, that this is it's a conflict, and it creates a system where we're basically saying, if you say you're guilty now, whether you are or not, this is going to be the best chance that you get. So.
Great, thank you. That's exactly the kind of answer I had imagined from you, because I know the kind of work that you do. I've read a lot of work on with victims of violent crimes as well, right? So I know that all of the cases that come through there, of course, the system, from what I've learned in Paul Butler's book, is they call it broken, but it's actually it's doing what it's designed to do. So it's more like actually not needing reform, but rather transformation. Those are Paul Butler's work. So I want to talk about to Rudy. Did you take a plea bargain in your trial? Did you case go to trial or a plea bargain, and how do you feel about that sentence? And what are some problems about the long sentences?
Well, first of all, I did not take the plea bargain, but okay, is that good? Can you guys hear me? Yeah, you can hear me. Okay, so first I'd like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank UCLA, for hosting us and having us here. But yeah, no, I did not take a plea bargain. I wasn't willing to deal because I kind of understood the law a little bit better, and the deal that they were giving me was not actually a bargain. It was a bargain for the DA's office. So I understood going in there that I should take my chances at trial. In my case, they attempted to make it a gang case when no one else was arrested, and I was arrested on a fingerprint. So I couldn't, there was no way for me to get around that, because it's a damning piece of evidence when they have a fingerprint. Other than DNA, a fingerprint is pretty solid evidence. And later on, confidential information. So they try to make it a mass conspiracy and actually really penalize that. So they use my history in CDCR as a validated gang member, an active gang member, to try to make and worsen, the sentence. So the bargain that they offered really wasn't a bargain for me. So I wasn't willing to accept it or to deal with the district attorney's office at that point. And they also tried to make it a 3-strike case on top of that. On top of the gun enhancements and the gang enhancements, they wanted to make it a 3-strike case. But the crime that I committed as a juvenile, I was 14 at the time, so they couldn't use that as a strikeable offense. So being that I had a fair understanding of the law, I knew this. So I took this to my lawyer and I explained to him, and he researched and he said, you know what, you're right. You were not 16 at the time of the crime, so they could not prosecute you and give you a 3rd strike. And you're also right that they can't use your history against you because, being that no one else was arrested in the crime other than myself. So when they offered me the deal, it wasn't a good deal, so I took it to trial. And I ended up losing that trial and ended up spending 20 years in prison, 15 of them in solitary confinement. So how do I feel about the sentence I received? I felt that the sentence, I felt that it was just. I felt that it was just in the sense that there was a lot of other crimes that I had committed, and there was other crimes that I was going to commit in the future. I was part of a criminal conspiracy, and we sold drugs, and we were bent on creating chaos in society, and murdering people. So that's what I was involved in. But I can readily admit that today because of the intrinsic work that I did while I was incarcerated, so that I can understand the criminal thinking and my addiction to a lifestyle that goes beyond any substance, that has to deal with gang membership, violence, money, pistols, all the things that young men and some young women are addicted to. And it took me well over 15 years to understand this. So I believe my sentence was just, but not in every case is it just for you to bring a gang enhancement or a gun enhancement or any type of bargain where there's no evidence to prove that a gang was involved or they did it in furtherance of a gang. So in my case, I believe my sentence was just. And I believe that prison did me a lot of good. I came out a reformed man, and it took decades. It took me 15 years to drop out of a gang. Most people would have left it within a year or even less. I stood in solitary confinement because I was defiant against the government, against California, against an unjust system. So I became an advocate in the prison system. So my hatred for my captor led me to learn the law, to study it, to understand, just like Hillary was talking about going into the DA's office to learn something about the enemy. So that's why I got in the books, to learn about the man. I wanted to understand their system. So that's what it did for me. And in the process, not only did I learn the system, but I started to learn about myself and to value certain things. And the thing that I value the most right now today is my freedom. And I learned to value my freedom so that I wouldn't commit another crime. Because I wanted to be free, I wanted to be out, and I wanted to complete this sentence and to pay my just due to society, to the people that we terrorized, to the victims that I knew and that I didn't know, to the mothers that lost sons because of the crimes that we committed, that lost daughters, that lost family members to drug addiction, and that lost family members to incarceration because we told them to do something that they were willing to do for us. So that's why I felt my sentence was just, and it was due.
So what the work basically that you did inside that you felt giving back, a term that a lot of people use for that is restorative justice. So you were pretty much doing it from the inside, which I think it's great, and I know that you continue to do that here, as a returning citizen, and honestly, Rudy's he's a mentor of mine through a program that I'm in as well, Manifest Works, along with Art there, that he helps people to get jobs in the entertainment industry, and he teaches them how to be successful at it. So I really admire you for that. I just want to let you know that. So I wanted to say also, now I want to direct to Dr. Garcia, Luis Garcia. So we have right here two of our panelists on the right here, on my right, are prison abolitionists. But I know that you're not. So, but having been incarcerated yourself, I wanted to ask you, what do you believe needs to change in the justice system in terms of sentencing and due process in order to see the end of mass incarceration?
Can everyone hear? Yes. Okay. So I just want to thank you for being here, everybody, and thank you to the panel as well. I just wanted to back up a little bit and kind of share a little bit about my story with the plea bargain process. My story really kind of began over 20 years ago when I was convicted of assault deadly weapon in 1991. And it was a plea bargain in that the offer was that if the offer was 3 years with half, and this is before a lot of the changes that happened after 3 strikes. And so, or if I go to trial, then I would face a maximum term of 4 years plus 3 years GBI enhancement. And so the offer was 3 years with half. So as a kid, I was 22 years old around there. I think it was 22 years old. Middle class family. Never been I've been in county jail a few times here and there. But here it was. I was faced with this state prison sentence, so I took it. And so I did my time in prison. I got out. Post 3 strikes, 95, I got arrested again. And this time it was for a commercial burglary. I stole a radio out of a car while I was drunk at the mall with my parents. And I was giving up at that point in life in my story. And when I went to arraignment, I was coming out of a hangover, and I literally tried to plead guilty to they were telling me I was going to face 32 months with 80%, and I tried to plead guilty to that. The judge refused and told me I needed to seek counsel. And so when I went back to court, after a couple of different hearings, they came at me with another, actually, kid you not, the story is what my attorney told me, is that the hard-nosed DA was out that day, and because they could have went back looked into my history with that GBI. It wasn't charged, but the thing was, it was like the hard-nosed DA was out of the courtroom that day, out sick. The one that was covering for him is offering you 2 years with half. So I took the 2 years. And fast forward, I get out, less than 90 days, I'm back in on a parole violation. So in my looking back in that experience, and the prison incarceration and the jails and all that stuff in many ways, I mean, it's just my past and the plea bargains, and I looking back, the decisions I made really kind of worked. I had to experience prison. I had to become something and someone that I wasn't. I got my ear sliced in prison. I couldn't press charges on it because of what would happen to me. And boy, did I want to get that, I wanted that gang member guy, that sliced my ear because he thought I shouldn't be talking to the white guys when this guy could barely speak English. That was like the anger that I had at that period in time. But I had to stay quiet because of the prison politics, and I moved on. So when I look at that background and when I look at my experiences within California's criminal justice system, to bring it into context, and I look at specifically in my experiences in the LA County criminal justice system, I'm just fortunate. I feels like I got spit out into the world when I got out of that prison, that parole violation 20 years ago. And when I went back to school, I move forward in my life. And meanwhile, we've had all these different changes, which I guess it gets to the point about the what needs to change in the justice system. Here in California, we've seen the implementation of AB 109, Public Safety Realignment, and then we have Prop 47 and Prop 57. For me personally, I think this AB 109 in many levels should be revisited for some of the issues, such as I don't think it's just or it's serving anybody to have a county jail inmate serving in 3 to 5 years in a county jail system, which is a system that was never designed to hold people for more longer than a year. Of course, if you're sentenced or you're fighting your case, if you're fighting your case, you're going to be in the county jail for, you can be up there up to 10 years, guys. But the issue is that I've had with AB 109 and looking at what has been going on is that the local county jail system is covered under the Title 15 regulations of minimum standards, which is different from the Title 15 CDCR's regulations. So you're actually getting a minimum level of care at the county jail level, which is put in, obviously, within the county jail level. Here in Los Angeles County, we have the Department of Health Services that took over mental health services from the Department of Mental Health. And we have now the Office of Diversion and Reentry that's under the Department of Health jurisdiction, not the Department of Mental Health or another department. So I think California, and specifically with these initiatives such as like AB 109 was done by the legislature, Prop 47 and 57 was done by the initiative. I think we're moving in a direction where, for those of us who got caught up in the system, have an opportunity to kind of clean up our past. And I don't qualify for any of the Prop 47, and obviously Prop 57 I'm not involved with. But nevertheless, I think for those that are in the middle of it right now, I think the California legislature, the initiatives in California's overall moment in time that where we're at right now is making a dent in this mass incarceration label. And I think as far as the abolitionist thing, for me personally, it's like an area that I know there's something like with me in my professional experience and the background that I had and recognizing how the players that are in this movement with shifting policies of mass incarceration, whether it be at the federal level, state level, system level, whether they're stakeholders, whether they're public agency stakeholders that never set a foot in a prison or in a jail or never had to strip naked or anything like that comes with being arrested. Sometimes the comment or sometimes the discussions, I can feel like an internal reaction that would come out when I hear things that I feel like is so far out there, so far removed. And it reminds me of like when I first got out of prison, looking for some hope and looking for some direction, and not kind of like, what's the word? Not believing the hype, I guess, because I remember early on getting caught up in some of the movements back in the late 90s, and it wasn't doing anything for me as far as like where I wanted to go in my life. So I asked myself, and I spent some time, and I'll share it. Am I an abolitionist? I said I would like to envision a world without prisons, eliminating imprisonment, policing and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. To me is like, and this is where my theology background is like, on earth that it is in heaven. This to me it's like this dream that we hope for. And for me personally, it's not difficult to imagine that world. I would probably, it would be nice to have a world of no prisons, or a world of policies that can come from a restorative justice framework. so I don't give up hope. And in my perspective, in my daily life, in my professional and personal life, I work towards improving society. So I think I'm looking at it from a practical standpoint. And I recognize that there's oppression and inequalities and how we've created this system of punishment, violence, and economic controls. And my vision is that we need to do a better job from cross-system collaboration with agencies here in LA County to build new models and to look at things in a wider lens that we've done in the past. So these small steps that I feel that I'm taking or towards this vision, I've kind of come to this kind of full circle thing where I probably do have some alignment with abolition thinking, but I'm still, I guess, kind of in the place of seeking, practical solutions, because I do feel like right now what's going on in the LA County Jail with the treatment of inmates, mental health inmates, is in an inhumane position where, we have different factions competing for different voice, but yet we have people in the modules in Men's Central Jail in a jail that's been there since 1960. That's like a dungeon, and something needs to be done. And if it needs to if the need or the means needs to be a new jail or a new health facility type of thing, for me, I'm for that, because again, it's like if I'm seeing it through the lens of what the person has to experience in the jail and when they come out into society and where they're trying to go in their life.
Thank you. So Rudy, I want to ask you now, what is it about sentencing? Do you have the most of a problem with? What can be changed right now to improve the way sentencing is?
I believe that, well, we're working on it, first of all, with ARC. We're working on our policies that we're taking to Sacramento. But I would like to say that I think I have the biggest problem right now with the enhancement system that we have. And a lot of people talk about, oh, well, the gun enhancements, and it's really bad, and we're going to work on changing it. And I understand that. But my problem is not the guns. It's the gang enhancement, because they criminalize a lot of people of color. So say, for instance, myself and friends of mine, we were validated as gang members as kids. We were probably like 11 or 12 years old, and they're pulling us over on the side of the street telling us to lift up our shirt to see if we had any tattoos or we had any markings that, associated us with the gang. There was never any formal validation process. Our parents didn't get to go to a hearing. We didn't go to a hearing to get validated. The cops did it on the side of the street. Now, you go to Westwood, go to Orange County and do that. Go to some nice place and tell the little kid, hey, pick up your shirt, let me see what you got. Turn around, let me see your back. Pull your pants down, let me see if you have anything on your legs. This is the things that are happening in California right now to people of color. It's not happening in Westwood. It's not happening over here in Santa Monica. So that's the beginning of the problem with the sentencing. That's how they begin the gang enhancement. They criminalized me hanging out with my cousin because we happen to be from the same neighborhood. I might be a